You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Hi, today I'm going to take you back to a Formula One from a long, long time ago in a regulation set far, far away from our own. Back in a time when Formula One had just been liberated from the Scuderia Death Star and the all-powerful Darth Schumacher by a young new hope called Fernando Alonso. But it's not about Fernando or El Plan. Our tale takes place before retired champion Sebastian Vettel even turned a wheel in Formula One. Lewis Hamilton was dicing in the Junior Series, and Red Bull were powered by a Ferrari engine. Our tale is a tale of 100 days. 100 days to get an F1 team onto the grid and beyond. Today we tell the tale of Super Aguri, and I am welcoming the man that was the technical big dog at Super Aguri and one of the most successful Formula E bosses around. It's Mark Preston. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark.
Thank you. It's going to be fun to talk about the history of Super Aguri.
Well, I hope you don't mind us having story time with Uncle Mark. And the thing is, it doesn't feel like it's a long time ago when you just say, 2006, 2007. But in Formula One terms, it's an eon ago.
It is, isn't it? I can hardly remember how far back it was. It's good to talk about it.
Yeah, and so you are familiar with some of the people on our panel. So Uncle Joe Saywood has stormed the paddock, and you've had to face him down in media. Is he as formidable as he seems in the shed?
Yes. When I first became technical director in Formula One, I was warned by my PR person that you're about to meet the formidable Joe Saywood, and be ready, be scared. And and I was, but it was a great conversation the first time I was interviewed by him.
And it's a really interesting path that Super Aguri took into Formula One, because the first car was basically the SA05, so after the year that it was developed, and it was essentially an upgraded 2002 Arrows car, and that seems insane in modern F1 terms. You could never try and enter F1 now with a 3-year-old car and just try and make it good.
Yeah, it was a funny story because obviously I'd worked at Arrows, and I'd been heavily involved in that A23 from Arrows, and so I knew I knew it backwards, I knew it forwards. I'd been really involved in it, and I'd known that Paul Stoddart had bought all of the assets of Arrows and had them down in Ledbury. So I'd actually gone and seen him the year before and said, "So if you've got everything?" He's like, "Yeah, come and have a look at everything." And I said, I was looking around, opening drawers and things like that, and going, "Oh yeah, I know where that is. I know what that is. Okay, cool." And so when the whole thing kicked off, we rang him up and said, "Can we buy it all back, please?" So it was quite a funny story. I had actually the reason I knew it was possible was after I was at Arrows.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, this is what I was going to ask, because I couldn't find like any big headline, but I just found one headline from like 2005 that said Mark Preston delays plans to join Super Aguri. Were those plans for Preston F1?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. So you actually had, that's an amazing thing. Like when you see the likes of like Jackie Stewart, struggling to make that work, and you thought, yep, I fancy a Mark Preston F1 team.
So I thought that was possible because I went off to McLaren after being at Arrows, and we did the famous, what I call now the technology demonstrator, the MP418A that never raced. And what happened in that situation was we actually had to take the previous year's car and put all the newest ideas on it and basically race it in the following year. So I knew it was possible to take a 1-year-old car, put all the latest technology on it, and we're at McLaren, so hey, we could do it at Super Aguri.
See, this is very much more reminiscent of like films like Rush, where it's a few guys with a garage and you're just in your blank green or grey overalls or covered in oil going, I think we can get this on the grid, we can make it work. And that's why I said, 2005 doesn't seem like a long time ago, but in F1 terms, it really is like it's ancient history. You could never go in with that attitude now, could you?
Probably not. I think the cars are so much more complicated. The engines are so much more complicated than they were back then. But it was a fun time because many of the suppliers that we normally used in F1. I remember when we were doing the fire up one night, 4 a.m. in the morning, there was a problem with one of the radiators, and the guy who owned the radiator company he came to us and he said, "Give it to me. I'll fix the radiator." So the guy who made radiators for the last, I don't know, 30 years
Yeah.
was with us at 4 a.m. in the morning and said, "No, no, give it to me. I'll fix it and put it back in the car." There was such a sort of a groundswell of support around us. All the supply chain in the UK just wanted us to make it happen. Extract, everybody. It was amazing.
So what's the crossover point from I'm going to be like the next Jackie Stewart entering the fray, or the next Frank Williams, Preston F1 into Super Aguri? Is that a sad story, or is that an opportunity taken?
It's an opportunity taken. We're just about to give up on the craziest, idea since sliced bread.
Yeah.
And then along came Aguri with obviously Takuma, Honda, Bridgestone, all the pieces of the puzzle from that sort of thing. But he was like, okay, now we have to do a team. And we said, well, we're ready to do a team. We know who we're going to hire. We know how we're going to do it. And so it was one of those weird moments when the two things just collide. It was incredible.
Okay, well, how much of an exaggeration is it to say that Super Aguri had the soul of Preston F1 that never was?
A fair amount actually, because most of the guys that ended up running the team had been with me for the previous year, looking at what we could do. A number of ex Arrows people, ex Jordan, ex other teams, and so we were all kind of ready to go and about to give up, and then all of a sudden this all happened in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, and it's unusually quick, that timeline from saying, right, this is going to be an entity in F1 to getting to the grid. But there's a relationship with Honda in there, so it's not quite a privateer team. It's something that we argue about on Missed Apex all the time. Is I always want there to be an opportunity for people to come in, almost like a customer team, with the backing of not just an engine supplier but full support. But you've come in with essentially an upgraded 3-year-old Arrows car, and then moving on to using or trying to use a Honda chassis. What was that relationship like with Honda?
Honda was incredible. It is still legendary inside of Honda. So I still, meet young Honda guys and
Oh,
they
is
go,
it?
"Oh, Mark-san,
No way.
you're So there's still a lot of love for what we did inside of Honda. It was pretty crazy for even them actually internally, and it was interesting. They gave us some of the most experienced Honda guys that you've ever met, and I'm still friends with a lot of them. So they gave us an incredible amount of support, and it would not have been possible if they hadn't have put their full force behind what we were doing. But they were also a bit surprised because they didn't also know if we could do it. So yeah, that was pretty
Well,
amazing.
I don't think they were alone in wondering whether you could do it. But actually, it's nice to hear something so positive about Honda, because perhaps their reputation has taken a little bit of a kicking with the GP2 engine. And then just as they were getting good, kind of Red Bull seemed to have parked their relationship. And then, of course, they sort of famously let go of their team, handed it over to Brawn, and lost out on winning a world championship. So we've not heard a lot of positivity, and we've heard a lot about the cultural differences. So it's nice to hear, like you just saying, no, they're a great organization and a great team.
Yeah, we had some amazing characters in our team. Many of them that had been on the original McLarens, etc., back in the early days of the 80s, winning championships. So we
Oh,
had some pretty incredible characters that really really wanted us to get succeed and get to the grid, and then obviously we caused the main team a little bit of hassle in their second year for the keeping up with them, or leading them at least into the first half of the season.
so let's for people who have perhaps new to Formula One, not heard of Super Aguri. So we're talking about the seasons here between 2006, 2007, 2008. That was the three contested seasons. But I'd like to hone in on what we talked about earlier, which was the modified Arrows car. And so what's the thinking behind that? Because that couldn't have been like a long-term solution. Was that just we need to get our car and our name and our drivers on the grid?
There was a lot of confusion at the time because they were saying we'd have B teams in Formula One. So even I think ProDrive might have been
Ah.
rumored to have been a B team. Obviously,
Sorry, say
um,
that name again that was rumored to be a B team?
was going to be ProDrive.
Ah, right.
At the time, there was a discussion whether they were going to enter as well. Obviously, Red Bull bought Minardi and became their B team, which is
Yeah.
obviously now Toro Rosso. So there was a bit of confusion at the time as to how the rules were going to work out. And so, because there was a bit of confusion, the only way we could get to the grid was going to the Arrows plan.
Right.
So that's why it went that way. And everyone was thought we were crazy. But I remember Aguri said, "So how slow will we be?" And we said, "I think we're going to be 5.5 seconds off the pace." And he said, "Okay, is that okay?" And weirdly, that was the year that they got rid
Yeah.
of the 7% rule.
Right.
So we were confident that we wouldn't get kicked out, and we were confident that we would qualify, but we were quite confident we would be 5.5 seconds off the pace.
And we should say that that is as massive as it sounds. That was a big deficit.
Yeah, and by the thing I think we were all most proud of, and even Honda, was that by the end of the year we're only a second off the grid, off the Ferraris. But that was
Yeah.
with a lot of help from Bridgestone. That was when the tire war was, and so we were obviously partnered with Bridgestone. So that meant that we had some good tires, let's say, for that battle. And so we were most proud from going 5.5 seconds off to 1.5 seconds off, or 1 second off in Brazil, and that was a incredible ride, let's say.
So that must have, in a way, been a magical time. Even though you had one driver 5 seconds off, so that was the best of it. You had one driver 9 seconds off at one point. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So yeah.
So, but from a pure kind of engineering point of view, I think you and I are coverall donning spanner monkeys at heart.
Yeah.
That must have been just like almost like a duct tape and sellotape type project to get onto the grid. And in a way, like surely that's like the most joyful mechanic experience, even for a head technical guy.
Everybody in the team absolutely loved it, still loves it, still talks about that time and says, "I wish we could go back to that year." I mean, it was mental. I think we got off Christmas Day for when we were
Mm.
planning the team, but I don't think we had a weekend off, a Sunday off, anything until we got to the grid. But time flew by and nobody cared. It was an amazing experience. And by the end of that year, a number of the teams had seen what we were doing. So there's a picture you can search on the internet of at the end of the year. There's a mixture of Renault mechanics and Super Aguri mechanics. What happened was they brought the champagne down to the other end of the
Oh,
pit
wonderful.
lane to congratulate all the mechanics for working so hard. They'd seen us
Oh,
all working hard during the year, and we had some fun times when we realized we couldn't be quick, so we had to figure out ways that we could win. So we had to have little wins. So there's a classic one where in the starting grid where obviously they take the tire warmers off and then the cars head around the formation lap. What we realized was one day I was watching the grid and I saw that Ferrari would always be the last people to take the tire warmers off, and I was like, you know what? We could beat them at that. And so the next race, it doesn't matter if we get disqualified or we get a penalty because we're at the back of the grid.
yeah.
So we realized this is a very visual thing on the TV. So we worked with the mechanics and we went later than Ferrari. So when you see the shot looking at the grid, you'll see everyone, the mechanics take the tire warmers off
Mm.
in those days, but Ferrari and Renault would still have the tire warmers on and Super Aguri at the back, and so
Nice.
it was very visual on the TV. And so we waited and waited and waited, and they pulled the tire warmers off, and then we waited, and the TV people were going, "What are they doing at the back of the
Oh,
grid?" And then all of a sudden, we took ours off.
that's
So it was
glorious.
one of those crazy stories.
I do wonder, like, if teams at the back of the grid do things to get on the telly. And now I know. Now I've confirmed it's true.
Sorry, say that again. I just got cut off by Siri.
So I did always wonder as an F1 fan whether, teams down the back end of the grid ever did things to get on TV. And it's a delight to know that's true.
We also took a lot of the other variables like pit stops. Back in those days, you could actually compete. I don't know if we could have competed nowadays on the 1 point something second pit stops, but we also tried to win the fastest pit stop. There was things like when the drivers come into the pits, they try to sort of attack the line, as they call
Right.
it. So the line when you enter the pits, and you have to get down to pit lane speed. The speed at which you can get to that line and brake and
Yeah.
get to the speed in pit lane, we used to try and beat that time. And then so what happened was
Love
that
it.
the big teams realized what we were doing, because I'm sure we showed up on their screens. Why is this Super Aguri guys winning these little things? And then the mechanics came and asked us, "What are you guys doing?" We're like, "We can't win, but we could beat you at some things. So
That's
we try to
amazing.
beat you at the little things."
So if you look at the Super Aguri 2006 top trumps card, you might have
Yeah,
like pace down at 4, resources down at 5, but pit lane entry 10.
Yeah, exactly.
Tire warming, tire blanket chicken 9. So
Yeah,
that's pretty
yeah,
good.
exactly. Yeah,
I no, I
pointless
love
things
that.
to most people.
And I love the fact that there was respect from Renault, who we have to remember were champions at that time. So Fernando Alonso won the 2006 and 2005 World Championships with Renault back to back before moving to McLaren. But the visual of those guys coming down to the back of the grid with champagne is wonderful.
It was just the coolest thing ever. It's one of the best photos that we've still got from the time of that experience.
And actually, that was going to be my next question, which was how were you treated by the other teams in the paddock? Because the stories I read obviously were that there needed to be agreement from all the teams at that time, and I believe Midland were a team that put up resistance, and then Williams, if we sort of skip ahead a little bit to the first non-Arrows chassis, also were objecting to that. So apart from the Renault loving, how was the reaction from the other teams?
Yeah, I mean, Midland wasn't very happy that we were coming in, and so the top 10 Concord agreement and everything. There is a sliding scale of earnings and those
Yeah.
kind of things. So it does have an impact, which is obviously one of the discussion points they're having at the moment, isn't it, with the new teams entering? So yeah, it was a bit of a stress. We didn't know that we were going to actually get there until the FI eventually allowed us with a late entry to come to the grid, but because Honda was involved, of course, there was a lot of help, let's say, to get their second team into the series.
But okay, so there's two questions there. A, was it too much help because you were literally using a year-old chassis and admitting to it? It wasn't like a sneaky crime. It wasn't like, the Aston Martin brake duct gate or the, what did they call it? The pink Mercedes
Oh,
a
yeah.
couple of years back. No, no, we're using the chassis from the previous year.
And then that was the intent at the time, was that B teams were looking at
Mm,
how B teams could actually operate, and the idea was generally we could take a 1-year-old car, and most people thought that was going to be impossible, and obviously we took a 3-year-old car and
yeah,
showed that it was possible.
just about.
So we weren't going to be super quick, but we certainly had a lot of fun trying. So yeah, that was how it was meant to be, and that's why we were able to do it at least for a year or two, and then we would have had to figure it out like Toro Rosso did, to continue on as their own team.
So now a little bit out of Formula One specifically, and you look at the state of Formula One, there was a time when they were moving more towards customer teams, or like you could go and just purchase a chassis, or they were going to make it a little bit more of a spec series. All those kind of arguments have kind of seem to have been shelved, and it does look like Formula One wants to be more of a works team, like a manufacturer series. But at that time, like if you're looking back now, would you have wished that would have continued? Because I like the idea of a Mark Preston being able to come in, buy a 2-year-old chassis and go racing and have a 30-car grid.
Yeah, I mean that's that sort of, for me, it goes back to the really, really old days, doesn't it? The Brabhams and everybody who actually, built their own car, got an engine from this guy, got a bits and pieces from somebody else, and went racing. It's certainly the kind of old romantic side of motor racing, and so I think that bit is quite cool. Whether or not you could continue to compete nowadays, I'm not quite sure. But it was certainly a fun time, and I'm glad we got to do it.
Yeah, but I sort of feel like Formula One as an organisation has actively moved away from that, and they would rather have Audi come in with or people with pedigree coming in and have Alfa Romeo rebadged on Sauber than have Sauber.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, isn't it, to see what should be done nowadays. It was still a cool time, and as I say, I'm glad we got to do it. I the idea, you say that maybe it's not the same now, but am I correct in saying that Aston Martin uses Mercedes gearbox, right?
Sure.
And so one of the elements of it is, where do you spend your resources? And what we did was we had a car from Honda, obviously. So what did we do? We focused on the areas where we knew we could differentiate from them, which
Mm.
was tires at the time. So for me, it's engine aero tires, the three biggest, most important things. And so we had a Honda engine. we had Bridgestone tires, and it turned out that we were really good at tires, and so
What?
therefore we were able to keep up by putting a lot of effort into tires. And so, when you think about how much resource goes into a gearbox, it's it's ridiculous because it's a complicated thing, a really super complicated thing. So in some ways, there is still a lot of sharing of R&D because you can use an engine and a gearbox. That takes a lot of effort away from what you need to do.
Now, wonderfully and unbelievably, I know that you're actually a Missed Apex podcast listener, so you will know that me and my co-host argue about tyres, and I try to steer the conversation away. But just to save a phone call from Matt when he listens back to this, why was Super Aguri strong on tyres?
Because we had a great relationship with Bridgestone.
Now then,
Aguri
no, because I assign 9 of Michael Schumacher's 7 titles to the fact that they had Bridgestone tyres.
tires are the most important thing, and I probably my best experience of this was way back when I was doing Formula Fords in
Oh
Australia.
wow,
We
no
were able
aero,
to
no
do the
aero.
tire testing, but all about tires,
Yeah.
and we were able to help choose the tires, and so we chose the tires that were best for us. And you can see that what from that experience since then to now, I've focused incredibly on the tires, and they make an incredible difference. And so Aguri had been a Bridgestone tired driver since his karting days, and so we had a great relationship with
I
Bridgestone.
see. Yeah.
And obviously, there was the tire war going on, so we had a lot of support from Bridgestone. They were one of our sponsors as well, and that's how we helped to. That was one of the reasons we're able to get to within 1.5 seconds of the Ferraris by the end of the year with a 3-year-old chassis. Was we had Bridgestone tires.
That's incredible because the fabled stories of the Bridgestone tires. I think only six cars ran the Bridgestone tires at that time. So that was
Yep.
Ferrari, yourselves, and I've forgotten completely
Ooh,
now. Yeah,
me
yeah, yeah.
too.
There we go.
The other.
But basically, they had a little bit of an advantage. But the tale of lore is that they were designed around Michael Schumacher, and that Ferrari had this great relationship with Bridgestone.
100%. And if you can design your chassis and develop your chassis and aerodynamics around the tires, you can make huge gains. Which is why nowadays it's so much as a control system because basically they had a great advantage.
Oh, this has been such a leap back in time. I have to say, because I was in my mid-20s at the time, I thought, oh, this is a little bit of my darkest period of remembering stuff from Formula One. But all of this is flooding back now. The tire wars. When was the Indy Grand Prix, the Indianapolis Grand Prix?
Oh, I wasn't at that one. That
Ah, so
must
that
have
must have been
been there was a couple.
2005, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Yes,
So
yes,
just
that
for
was
anyone listening, that is basically the Bridgestones were the only tyres that were allowed in the end to run. The rest of the teams withdrew. So there was only 6 cars on the starting grid. But you weren't involved in that. So we
not at
can't.
that time.
I thought I could find a new person to blame for that. I guess the other interesting thing from your relationship with Honda was the drivers. So tell us a little bit about the driver selection. I know it ends up with Anthony Davison, but it doesn't start as perhaps as glamorously as that.
Yeah, obviously, Takuma. We had Takuma was one of the
Sato,
reasons
yeah,
why. Yeah, we basically were started because Takuma needed a drive, and we basically took him on, obviously. And we had Yuji Idi, we had Sakon Yamamoto, we had Frank Montani was there at one point. He was incredible as our third driver. That's when you had T cars, so the spare
yeah.
car that ran on a Friday. And obviously Anthony Davidson, who did an amazing job for us, and the two having him and Takuma was really really great fun.
So when you see Anthony Davison with his analysis on the SkyPad, and he just has this deep understanding of driving, and I believe like things like being hired by the Strolls to teach Lance Stroll in a 2-year-old Williams before he came into Formula One. Like he's a massively impressive driver, and I remember at the time, like, oh, there's a new British driver in, but he didn't spend too much time at the sharp end of the grid. But I feel like you would have good things to say about him.
Oh yeah, we had a great time. It was a really fun time, as I say, over those couple of years at Super Aguri, and he was in the central part of making us quick. With him and Takuma together, we had a really, really great driver pairing.
So it might have been one of the more low key driver pairings, really, because neither of those guys got to be at the very sharp end. But I like, like Sato moving on with his American career, Anthony Davidson massively respected now. Like, how you must have been pretty pleased in the end to end up with a driver pairing like that.
Oh yeah, it was great, and they had different styles. So Takuma was a more of a sort of aggressive driver. Anthony was a much more a smoother driver. And what we noticed was that certain tracks, one of them will be better than the other because of the type of track and how it suited each driver's style. And so, one circuit we say, well, Anthony, you're going to be quicker here than Takuma, and this track you're going to be quicker than Anthony because of the way you drive the
And you
car.
could see that in advance, and you could be like, "Sorry, Anthony, we know this is not a Davison track."
So when you look at the surface of the track, now we're going to get really geeky
No,
about
no,
tires.
please do. I won't understand, but our listeners will. So please do.
When you analyze the type of surface of the track, we could see that some tracks were more aggressive on the tires, and we would say, "All right, you're going to be able to warm up the tires quicker at this track, Takuma, so you're going to be quicker straight away. Anthony, you're going to be a bit slower because this doesn't suit the tire, the way you warm up tires and the way you control the tire wear and degradation." And so we did actually start to become able to say, "This is going to be your track. This is going to be your track," and it did turn out to be the case. And we continue, and all the teams obviously look at this in the background. They look at the roughness of the surface in a few different parameters, and they can tell, what sort of track this is going to be, how it's going to put energy into the tires, and those kind of things. There's a lot of science behind it, as you can imagine.
I wonder how much that still goes on today because we talk about different driver styles a lot, but as you'd imagine, between 2008 and 2023, you'd imagine the driver market and driver skill in general would have evolved. But there must still be a nagging feeling, say, in Sainz's mind and go, oh, we're going to Australia. That's not the kind of track that suits me. But we don't really hear about it, maybe because of the PR side of things.
I mean, we've still used the same techniques in Formula E. So we took a lot of the same ideas from that we'd learned in F1 and applied them in Formula E. We probably didn't have enough resources. We didn't have enough sensors on a Formula E car to be able to measure some of the things you can measure in F1. So we can't be sure in Formula E how some of those parameters work. But we continue to do some of the same types of analysis in Formula E as well. And that was certainly part of our success in Formula E was understanding the tyres.
So how hard was it to get Anthony Davidson in though? Because when you first started, the driver you mentioned,
Yep,
Ed, was
yep,
a 31-year-old Japanese rookie. So I'm
yep.
going to go ahead and assume there was a big Honda influence in that initial driver lineup.
That was actually influenced by Aguri actually because I think he
Ah,
was racing
interesting.
for
Yes.
Aguri in Japan. So Aguri runs a Super GT team, and also at the time he would have run a Formula Nippon, I think it was called at the time, a teams there. So Yuji came from one of the teams in Formula Nippon.
And we should do some revision of Aguri Suzuki as a driver. What was his history?
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the most famous Japanese drivers because he was on the podium in Japan. So that was where he became, super famous. He's still super famous, of course, in Japan. It's amazing when you go around. I mean, one of the stories when we went to the Japanese Grand Prix for the first time, when we approached the paddock, let's say, in a car, there was thousands and thousands of Japanese fans just waiting for Aguri and Takuma to come to the
Really?
track.
Amazing.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. The amount of fans in the grandstands that had Super Aguri flags was Ferrari and Super Aguri. That's what it was like at Suzuka. It was incredible, absolutely incredible.
And I think, say, maybe newer American fans and the European fans sometimes forget how popular Formula One is in Japan. And I was a massive Kobayashi fan as well. Really disappointed when his career just fizzled out because he did a crowdfund at one point and he got like £1 million ready to try and buy a seat, and then that didn't work out. And then I think he still kept the money and went racing elsewhere.
Yeah.
But we went a long time without a Japanese driver.
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely crazy. When Japan was once and twice the last race in the season, as people were packing down the cars. in the last race. The Japanese fans would still be in the stands until we finished. And there used to be this competition, like a competition, I put it in
Who
inverted
could
commas,
stay?
and basically people used to blow up the engines at the end of the season. So if you look at there's a video on the internet about a fire up at Japan. Basically, it's basically the car sitting on its stands and the guys revving the engine and
Until
the
it goes.
exhaust blowing hot. And it didn't blow up, that one, but I know that historically there'd been some years where I think Jack Villeneuve just came out and just went full throttle, boom, the engine. So it was the end of the season, and certain teams would do that, and certain teams wouldn't do it.
If you have that link, I will share it with our listeners in the show notes below. But to sort of focus in, because this conversation has gone longer than I promised. I do apologize, but hopefully we can get you back in the shed at some point. The Super Aguri story isn't one of, obviously it's only 3 years, but 2007 looked hopeful. There was points on the board. So to start with the positivity of that, and then obviously into the inevitable question of why didn't that then continue?
Yeah, I mean, if we had, I was actually looking back at it and seeing how many points we got. Of course, the points at that time only went down to what was it,
Eighth, I think, at that point.
eighth position.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had a couple of times we ended up sixth, and we got 1 point or something or 2 points. But actually, if you'd had the current scoring system, we would have got quite a lot more points. But sadly, that was the time at which there was the financial crash, and
Right.
if you remember, Honda, Toyota, Bridgestone, all of the Japanese companies pulled out of Formula One at that point. So it was pretty much at the point of the big financial crisis, and Honda pulled out
Oh,
of F1.
is that what led to Honda pulling out of Formula One? I actually didn't know that. Obviously, Brawn then took that over in
Yep.
2009 and won the Drivers' Championship that year.
Yes.
So I
Yep.
didn't realize there was a link between those two things. So did you feel the shockwaves of Honda support earlier than their eventual withdrawal?
Yes. Yeah.
Ah,
Basically, that was it. Yeah. Basically, that was in a nutshell.
but that's a shame because in 2007, it was looking reasonably competitive. And those points weren't fluked points. They were
Yeah.
expected points going forward. So did you go into 2008 going, it's back to like the duct tape of the Arrows car this year?
I think everyone was quite hopeful, but there was a lot of things going on in the world that I think some of the ramifications
Yeah.
of the financial crash were actually starting to ripple through before it became the big crash. So we were starting to feel some of those impacts before it was, let's say, common knowledge that everything was going wrong in the world. So yeah, we felt them a bit earlier.
So I had planned to ask you about Formula E, and I hope you will come back and talk to us, because I think if we look a decade ahead, or even like 2 decades ahead, we've got a convergence coming with the top tier of motorsport wanting to be road relevant. But I think for today, so that you don't get fed up of me and go, he never let me get back to my dinner, right? I will leave it on one question mark.
Hmm.
Are you happy that it was Super Aguri that you were involved in, or would you have preferred, if you can go back in time, would it have been Preston F1?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Preston F1 would have actually ever taken off with the same vigor, let's say, and had a car company like Honda behind it. So it was an incredible journey, and I really enjoyed working with Aguri, and of course everybody at Super Aguri and Honda and everyone that made it happen. So I'm glad it went that way.
Mark Preston, thank you so much for your time. We're going to try and get everyone to swarm you on Twitter and pepper you with questions, and hopefully you'll come and join us in the shed again. Mark Preston, appreciate your time, and thank you for making the effort.
Thank you. It's been good fun.